Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Watercolor Hour. Today we're going to be painting some watercolor seashells. So if you picked up your kit, you should have everything that you need. Let's go ahead and grab that and we'll get started. I'm going to go over everything that you have in your kit. You should have this printout which shows the shells that I used as a reference, along with the final paintings. You should have this line drawing to trace. You should have 6 paint colors, a piece of scrap paper for testing your colors on, a round brush and a detail brush, a piece of watercolor paper, and I threw in a couple of shells in case you want to try painting your own shells later on. So you're going to need to grab some water to rinse off your brush and some paper towels to dry it off, and a palette or a plate to mix your colors on. The first thing I do is trace the line drawing. So you can use your light box or tape it up to a window and trace it that way. So you'll notice on this, I went ahead and traced the shells as well as these lines around the shells. So these extra lines here are going to be the shadows. So I'm not going to start by painting those. I'm going to paint the shells and then go back in. The next thing I'm going to do is see what my colors look like. So I've got orange, permanent red violet. I'm not really sure how to say this one. Gothite. I don't know. It's a light brown. Burnt sienna, which is a reddish brown. Burnt umber, which is a cool brown, and Payne's gray, which is just a dark gray. So we're going to be mixing these for the shell colors. So the first thing I do when I start painting is figure out what colors I want. So this is a huge mess, but I usually just throw some colors down and mix them up and see what I get. So I'm going to start by mixing some of my colors. I'm going to mix burnt sienna and permanent red violet to start off with. What I want is something like this. And as you're working, of course, if you mix your own colors, it's a good idea to write down your mixes, because sometimes you'll be painting and you'll forget what you mixed and you'll have to make more of that color. And then it's frustrating trying to figure that out. And I'm going to mix some of my burnt sienna with the light brown. I'm just going to call it gothite. I don't know what it's called. I'm just trying to make that light brown a little bit darker. I'm going to mix the permanent orange with the red violet. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it's a little too opaque. The orange is pretty opaque, so I'm just adding water to tone that down. Okay, so I just want a pinky orange shade. And then I've got some burnt sienna and burnt umber here. I just want a dark brown. Not really going to use the Payne's Gray too much. I'm using it for the shadows, and I may use it to darken up some of the colors later, but for now I'm not using it. So you just want a mix of different brown colors for your shells. This one is Burnt Sienna. And I'm just using the first letter of each of those. Okay, so once you've got your colors, you're going to start on your shells. And I'm going to start with the easiest one, which to me was this sort of swirly one. And I don't have a reference for that because I drew that and I just sort of looked at these swirly shells that I had and used that for my reference. So the first thing I'm going to do is just put a light, very light brown shade down. And remember not to fill in the shadow yet, although if you do, it's not a huge deal because we're going to cover that up with gray, but for now I'm just trying to leave that space blank. This is a light brown and you're not going to see too much of it because we're going to add darker colors, as you can see here. But it's going to show through on some of these lighter spots. So what I'm going to do now is let that dry, and then I'll be right back to add some details. Okay, while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to fill this in. So I'm just putting down the same light brown color. And for this one, I'm going to avoid these light areas, the little white strips in between each section of the shell. And for this one, I am just painting the whole thing. So I'm going to be careful with these sections up here just because they're smaller, and I'm going to grab my smaller brush with these. Okay, so this should be fairly dry by now, so I'm going to come back in and start adding some of the darker colors. So for that, I'm going to use this mix of burnt sienna and burnt umber. But first I'm going to get the shell wet. I'm going to leave this little oval section here dry, and I'm just going to get the rest of the shell wet. So I'm bringing the water right up to here. Now I'm going to grab my small brush and grab the darker paint and start adding it here. So you can see since the paper's wet, it'll spread out on its own. And I'm going to grab some of the burnt sienna straight from here. So it's going to be really dark. And do the same thing. And you can mix in different shades of brown if you want. You don't want to fill in the whole shell though, because there are some areas that are lighter. So I'm trying to keep the darker color in the middle. And I'm just going to use my brush to kind of spread it out. I'm going to grab some of the mix here. And I'm not making my brush completely soaked with paint. And I'm going to go around the edge. I'm just making the edge a little bit darker. So I didn't get it wet enough, so it's not spreading. So I'm just rinsing off my brush after I do that, and then just kind of blurring the line. So once this is mostly dried off, you can come back in with your darker colors. And I've got a mix of all the browns here. I think I threw in just a tiny bit of orange. And so I'm going to be using my brush, it's mostly dry, it's got a little bit of paint on it. And I'm adding the details and going around all of the spaces that should be light. And so it doesn't have to be precise. You're just dragging your brush around. And over here it'll be darker, so I'm going to add this dark paint and then rinse my brush off and just kind of drag this around. And rinse off my brush again. So you just want it to be darker in the center and then lighter as you go out. And I've got some of the darker paint out here along the edge. And rinse my brush off. And just move the paint around and leave little spaces that are lighter. Okay, and I'm going to grab a little bit of my Payne's Gray and just add it to the center here. And I'm going to grab some of that darker paint and just dot it in the middle. So I'm not going to fill in this whole space, but I'm just going to add a little bit of the darker paint. Okay, so we are going to move on to this next one. So for this one, it is a lighter brown shell. So I'm going to be using a mix of the burnt sienna and this light brown gothite shade. And again, there are some spaces that need to be kept lighter, so those are highlighted in the line drawings. So all these little spaces I'm going to try to avoid. So it's a lot of the same as we did last time, just using the brush on dry paper and avoiding those lighter areas. I'm going to switch over to my larger brush because this is a bigger shell. I'm just adding some paint up here, so it's a little bit darker. And now I'm going to fill in these spaces up here. So I'm going to mix a little bit more paint because I ran out. And I'm going to use my small brush. And I'm going to drag the paint along the top. And then rinse off my brush. And add water to the other side of this little section here until it meets this top area. Hopefully the top will be a little bit darker. And do the same thing for each section. So run your darker paint along the top of each section. Then rinse off the brush and add water to fill in the rest of the space. And while this is still wet, I'm going to come in with one of my darker shades here. Just add a little bit of that to the top. And I'm just dotting it on with the brush. And I'm going to come in and make this darker as well. So you don't have to cover the whole shell with this darker shade. You can leave some areas a lighter brown. Okay, and then I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to grab some of this burnt umber, and I want it to be mostly paint on my brush. Oh, that's too much paint. But I want it pretty dark, and then I'm going to use that to define these lines. I'm just running my paint along this edge. And then same thing here. If your paint has started to dry, you may have to blend this out. So I'm just gonna grab some water on my brush because these sections they've started to dry off. And I'm just adding water to blend this. And I'm just going to do the same thing until I'm finished. So just run the dark paint along both edges of this section. Rinse off my brush. And add some water. And this is just so the lines aren't so harsh. It gets harder to do as you move up though, because these sections are so tiny. And these are not going to be perfect, but that's okay. Okay, so this is pretty much done. If you want to go back in and add spots to your shell or different shades, you can. So I just grabbed some burnt sienna and I'm going to come in and just add some all over here. This one isn't super precise, so. All right, so this one is pretty much done. That got a little dark. I'm just gonna add water to that. Okay, so now we're gonna work on this one. So with this one, we're just going to work in sections, and we're going to be leaving some light space in between. So for this, I'm going to be using kind of a reddish brown. So this is my mix of permanent red violet and burnt sienna. So I'm just going to water this down a little bit. See what this looks like. So that's fine. So that's going to be the first layer of color. So I'm just going to grab this and fill in every section. And this brush is tiny. Maybe I should have switched to the other one. But I want to make sure that I don't go over into these spaces in between here. Okay, so we've got our first layer dry. And I'm going to come in with some of my watered down brown and just add it to different sections. As long as my paper's still wet, it should be okay. So this one started to dry off already. Okay, so now I'm going to wait for this to dry and then I will come back and add some details. Okay, so this one's mostly dry, so I'm going to start adding some details. So I'm just going to take my brush and I've got a mix of burnt sienna and the permanent red violet. So it's kind of a, I don't know, pinky brown, maroon shade. I'm going to take my brush and just kind of spread this on. And it's not precise or anything, I'm just adding color to it. I'm going to do the same thing down here. And now I'm grabbing some of my brown and I'm just kind of dropping it in. So I'm not waiting for it to dry, I'm just adding the brown on top of what I just painted. So I'm going to take some of the burnt sienna on my brush directly from the card, so it's really dark. It's mostly paint, not a lot of water. And I'm just going to go along the edges of all of these areas, just like I did with this one over here. So we're just making those spaces in between there really obvious with the darker paint. And then I'm going to take some of my burnt sienna and just darken some spots. So this area got a little bit too much paint, so I'm going to wipe some of that up. And I can just add more paint back here, that's not a big deal. And then come back over here. Okay, so I'm almost there. Now I'm just going to be adding dark paint. So I'm going to be using the burnt sienna again. A little bit more water on my brush. And I'll just be painting stripes. So all the colors that we had on there before should show through the darker paint. I'm just adding some darker paint to this side. And there's no, set amount for the stripes. It's just, you want it to be obvious that there are different shades in each section. So I've got my burnt sienna and just coming back and making these lines a little thinner. I think I left too much white space in between some of these. And if you've got your stripes down and they're too obvious, you can always come back and just blur the lines with water. So I've got a really pale brown. This is just watered down paint from earlier. And some of these stripy, or some of the white areas are a little too light, so I'm just taking water and running my brush along. Okay, so now we're going to work on our shadows. So I'm just going to be using Payne's Gray for that. I'm not sure what shape of shells you have, but if you have something similar, hopefully you all got something like this. You can put it down on your table and see where the shadows show up. Of course, it's going to depend on where your light is. For my reference, the light was coming from a little bit of a different spot. So it's not exactly the same, but I'm going to follow the lines that I have here. And I'm just going to fill this space in with water. So I'm leaving white space in the middle because the shell that I have here has white along the edge, so I'm just going to leave that alone. And then I'm going to take my Payne's Gray, and it's a really dark shade, so I am going to water it down. And just start filling this in. So I'm sticking close to the edge of the shell with the darker paint. And then I'm rinsing off my brush and kind of spreading it. So that's pretty light, so I'm going to add a little bit more. I'm just dropping in the Payne's Gray closer to the shell. So that it's darker along the shell's edge, and then it kind of gets lighter as the shadow goes out. And now I've got water on my brush and I'm just running it along the edge to soften it even more. So my water's kind of dirty, but that's okay. So I'm going to do the same thing with these other ones. So this one doesn't have as much of a shadow. I'm just putting a little bit of water down, and then I'll come in with my gray. And just drop a little bit in, rinse off my brush, and start spreading this out. And then I've got just water on my brush and I'm just softening this. I've got too light, so I'm just adding some more of the gray. And same thing over here. I'm going to get this a little bit wet. Get my gray, run it along the edge. And I'm just spreading this out. I'm just rinsing off my brush. And running it along there. Okay, so now we've got our shells. And I hope you have fun experimenting with them. If you have seashells at home, feel free to try this out. I would love to see your finished work. You can either email it to me or post it as a comment on Facebook. This is our last painting tutorial for the summer. We will be back in September for more painting. We go on break in August so that we can plan for the fall. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you back in the fall.